Romans 7, starting in verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. The supermodel Cameron Russell once said in an interview that she's never met a model who didn't feel insecure about their body. What? Most of us think if we could just diet and exercise our way into the image of a supermodel, we'd finally be freed of the insecurity that we feel about our bodies. Billionaire John D. Rockefeller, America's first billionaire for whom the prestigious music venue in New York City is named, was once asked, "How much money is enough?" To which he famously responded, "Just a little bit more." A lesser-known story, novelist Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller attended a billionaire's party on Shelter Island just outside of New York City, and Vonnegut informed Heller as they were there that their host had made more money in a single day than Heller made on Catch-22, his most successful novel, to which Heller responded, "Yes, but I have something he will never have: enough." In his book, The Psychology of Money, the Wall Street Journal columnist Morgan Housel says that the hardest financial skill to cultivate in the modern American economy is contentment. We can't seem to get the goalposts to stop moving, to be content with what I have rather than to keep on climbing, upgrading, and associating what is financially normal with the ascending socioeconomic brackets that the successful move through. He concludes, modern capitalism is a pro at two things: generating wealth and generating envy. In recovery meetings all over the world, you will hear the phrase, "One is too many and 1,000 is not enough," summarizing an addict's relationship to their substance of choice, a line that is traced back not to the big book, but to the Irish poet Brendan Behan. An alcoholic is someone who is able to self-deceive again and again to think that the next drink, which I'm always constantly planning, will be satisfying, but it never is. And of course, this very principle applies to the choice addiction of every human being, whether it be career success or public recognition or sugar or a certain size frame. Pick your poison. It is a bottomless pit. Happy New Year. It is these very concepts that Paul is grappling with in Romans chapter 7. So let's return to the text that we read just a moment ago, starting again in verse 7. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." Now that last bit you'll see in our English Bibles in quotations, and that's because it is no longer Paul speaking. He's quoting another voice. In this instance, he is quoting the voice of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and more specifically, he's quoting from the 10 Commandments, which are recorded in both Exodus and Deuteronomy. Exodus chapter 20 says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." You see, when we want to emphasize a particular word or phrase in English, we use italics or underline, or for the particularly obnoxious among us, all caps. In ancient Hebrew, in the Old Testament, though, emphasis was conveyed through repetition. That's why Isaiah chapter 6 says, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." And it's why Jesus, who is a Jewish rabbinical teacher, would often say things like, "Truly, truly, I say to you." That matters for us because of all the 10 Commandments, only one of them gets named twice. It's the last one. You shall not covet, you shall not covet. Not only that, but this final commandment, the one that's repeated, it is then followed by 7 potential expressions of coveting. Your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. 7 examples. Of course there's 7, right? Because 7 is the Hebrew number of completion, a number that implies the infinite. This is an unending list of possible ways that covetousness might take root in you and me. So in the 10 Commandments, both times they're recorded in Scripture, you get 9 straightforward commands and then a last one that is double emphasized. Obviously, in both cases, the author is drawing the reader's attention particularly to this last commandment. Why is that? When the command is repeated in the Bible later in Deuteronomy 5, there's an interesting wrinkle. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not set your desire on your neighbor's house or land, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Now, here we have the same unique repetition. You get the same 7 examples, only the second covet appears set your desire on. And that's an important detail. It's why Paul goes on to say, to return to Romans 7, pick up with me in your Bibles in verse 8, but sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. Now look, if all Paul had in mind here was my neighbor got a new ox and it seems to plow with more vigor than my old girl, or my neighbor settled down and tied the knot and I know it's wrong, but his wife's got me all hot and bothered. The expressions of coveting that are noted in the 10 Commandments, if that's all he had in mind, we wouldn't need the phrase, every kind of coveting, right? Covet in Romans 7 is actually the Greek term epithumetes. Can you try saying that with me? Well done. Which can be translated covet, but it can equally be translated as desire or lust. In Romans 7, it's brought into English as covet because Paul is quoting the Hebrew Bible authors, but the same Greek term is used by James in chapter 1 of his later New Testament letter when he writes, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, gives birth to death. This reference is hearkening back to Deuteronomy 5, you shall not set your desire on your neighbor's house or land. So covet, in the minds of both the Old Testament and New Testament authors, refers not only to wishing I had what someone else has, but it refers more broadly to that deep internal root to which all wrong can be traced. Why would the author of the Torah set this command apart from the other 9? Because covetousness is the invisible internal condition that gives birth to wrong action, making the other 9 commandments necessary. It's different than the 9 that precede it because all of those are about outward, observable, destructive behavior. Covetousness is about internal, invisible, destructive desire, but it comes out of us in a myriad of actions, all of which hurt me and the people around me. Why would Paul pick this out of all the 10 Commandments for his most psychologically honest flurry, confessing his own felt experience with sin? Because coveting is the invisible inner condition of disordered desire upstream from all wrong action. So in the minds of the biblical authors, covet was less like one particular sin, and it was more like the subtle, unnamed root to which all sin can be traced. That's interesting, isn't it? Let's try to pull that 2,000 years forward to today. Covet, in the simplest terms, is desiring for myself what another has. It involves a sense of comparison and competition with other people, comparing my possessions, looks, status, and so forth to someone else. Competing, like evaluating my self-worth based on an internal scoreboard I'm keeping against some outer reference point, a person or a people who in my life serve as the barometer of how I'm doing. Covet, then, is the biblical terminology for what we mostly call envy today. Envy is considered to be the most broadly experienced of the 7 deadly sins codified in church history, but also as the sin that people are least likely to identify within themselves. I once heard a seasoned psychiatrist, more than 40 years into practice, asked, "What is the most common regret your patients feel?" And without hesitation, he said, "Selfishness. I wish I'd been a less selfish spouse or parent or friend or neighbor." When an individual is looking back self-reflectively on who they've become, everyone identifies some forms of selfishness they wish they'd curbed. And then he was asked, "How many patients have you seen that identified selfishness as the core issue they were coming to you with?" And he said, "0. I've never had anyone seek out counseling for that condition." The most universally recognized regret is the least recognized problem. And envy has been thought of like that throughout much of church history. So if we're going to avoid such a tragically common deception, then we're going to need to define, diagnose, and discern envy. Let's begin with a definition. John of Damascus, an 8th century Arab monk, wrote the most enduring definition of envy to date. Envy is pain over the good fortune of others. Carmelite friar Richard Lavenham defined it: envy is the sorrow which one creature has when another fares well, or gladness that he fares evil. More recently, I heard a pastor define envy: when you resent God's goodness in other people's lives and ignore God's goodness in your own life. Putting all of those together, I would offer this definition. Envy is feelings of personal inadequacy expressed as passive resentment over the good fortune of others or active delight in their misfortune. Personal inadequacy is the soil within which envy grows. It charades as security by mocking another person, but the truth is the envious are insecure, uncertain of themselves, feeling not enough in some way that leaps out of them critically toward another. Envy is the condition that's in everyone, but nobody thinks they've got it. As a pastor of almost a couple decades now, I've heard nearly every confession under the sun. And in my own apprenticeship to Jesus, I've done plenty of my own confession, but in honest reflection, not once have I ever heard envy confessed. And not once have I ever confessed it. Envy is hiding within so many of us, robbing us of joy, but we don't recognize it. So we're going to need a proper diagnosis. Envy's most pronounced symptoms are comparison and competition. Human beings tend to compare themselves with those closest to us and whose lives are most similar to our own. In other words, you're unlikely to measure your physical appearance against a supermodel's, or your professional accomplishments against Jeff Bezos, or your athletic prowess against Michael Phelps. But your friend whose new diet's going surprisingly well and they're looking slimmer and 5 years younger, or your recently promoted coworker, or your formerly unemployed friend who you pitied for a while, then they inherited cash from their family and now they're doing a kitchen remodel that looks a lot better than yours. Sociologist Alain de Botton refers to this as the curse of the reference group. He says we always compare ourselves to those whose lives are really similar to our own, but they're just a notch above. Right? We're aging and we envy the friend whose complexion looks younger and healthier than our own. We're single and we envy the friend who finds a partner and starts dating. We feel stuck in a bad marriage and we envy the coworker who's single and free. We're struggling with infertility and we feel less than our friends who have children. Our lives are bogged down by our children, and we begin to begrudge people who don't have children because of how much free time they've got. We've got a son struggling in school and we effortlessly judge the parent whose son is doing well in school. We rent an apartment and we envy our sister who owns a house. Or we own a house and we envy our brother who owns a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood with better property values. Or we own a big house in a nice neighborhood with great property values and we envy our mother-in-law who owns a house and a vacation property. We compare ourselves to those whose lives are similar to our own, a reference group, and the reference group that we choose is always just one notch above. But how hard it is to look a notch below. How hard it is to consider the family of 4 who has a home with one less bedroom than my own. How hard it is to consider driving an even older, jankier car than mine that keeps breaking down. How hard it is to consider a slightly more overcrowded school district than the one my children are in. How hard it is to consider those whose salary is a little bit less than mine, or whose in-laws live a little bit closer than mine, or whose family of origin is a little bit further away than mine. How hard it is to consider those who work a few more hours than I do, or whose job search has been going on a little bit longer and looking a little bit bleaker than my own. You see, it's always up that we instinctively look toward envy, rarely down toward empathy. And our modern technological age has poured gasoline on envy's fire. Historian Yuval Noah Harari points out that if you were an 18-year-old youth in a small village 5,000 years ago, you almost certainly would have thought you were good looking. Because there's probably only like 50 other males in your village, and a lot of them were elderly or infants. So everyone was a big fish in a small pond. But if you're a teenager today, you're almost guaranteed to feel inadequate, left out, not cool enough, not athletic enough, not accomplished enough. Because teenagers today aren't at home alone on a Friday night eating a bowl of ice cream watching Dawson's Creek like I was. Right? They're home alone on a Friday night eating a bowl of ice cream, scrolling through a feed of what everyone else is doing that they weren't invited to. This tendency toward comparison so easily then leaps out of us in competition. And if you want to identify the reference group that you're currently competing with, look no further than the way that you talk about others when they're not around. These days we use the term gossip as a single catch-all for every form of speaking ill of someone else who's not present. But in the medieval church, there were 3 separate varieties of envious speech. It was grouching, murmuration, and backbiting. Now, grouching is a lot like how we use the word gossip today. Murmuration, on the other hand, is that like out of the side of your mouth whisper, painting somebody else in an unflattering light. I heard she moved to Seattle. How's she liking it? Well, she thought it rained too much in Portland, so that kind of thing. Or backbiting, it's that version of gossip that sounds complimentary and then includes a well-timed but. Right? Oh, he makes good money with great benefits, but he does work at his uncle's company. That kind of thing. In his book, The Anxious Generation, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt paints a fascinating picture of the similarities and differences of the way adolescent boys and girls deal with envy. Boys, he says, thrive in stable packs, and they tend to live with a wolf pack or gang sort of mentality, and they express their envy physically by competing or battling or fighting another pack for dominance. Girls very similarly thrive in stable packs, he says, but they have that same gang or wolf pack mentality, but they express their envy verbally. When an adolescent girl feels envy, she tries to do violence by turning the pack against the one she envies. She does her best to convince everyone else in the group of her point of view, planting her negative opinion about someone else in the minds of every mutual friend. It's just as violent. In fact, it might even be more violent, but it is so much more subtle. And the wound that is left by being ostracized by the pack is so much deeper, so much more painful, and takes so much longer to heal than the one through competing and fighting. Boys, as they come of age, says Haidt, for the most part, grow out of physical violence. But both boys and girls hold on to the subtle verbal violence of turning the group against another that we call gossip. Gossip is dealing with the shame that lives at envy's core by asking someone else to help me lift the shame off my own back and put it on another person who's not present. In a recent article for Time magazine titled "Reality TV Has Reshaped Our World Whether We Like It or Not," author Judy Berman explores the cultural shifts that have been brought on by our modern obsession with observing the lives of strangers. Watching reality television teaches us to minimize people, to form opinions or to categorize them as villain or hero, as substantive or shallow, to make somebody less or more. Most reality television is an exercise in your living room in exploiting people for their insecurities by making light of their embarrassment or forming judgments or opinions on who should get voted off the island or who should make it to the next round or who deserves the final rose. It's an exercise in judgment and categorization. It is the practice of dehumanizing and diminishing. All of this behavior, adolescent wolf packs and adult gossip, media as failure porn, all of it is rooted in feelings of personal inadequacy. A deep sense of personal security doesn't delight in the downfall of others, doesn't seek security in exclusive groups, doesn't chip away at others with words as weapons. Security celebrates others, sees others with compassion, offers love when it's easy and when it's hard out of a default setting of empathy, which is envy's opposite. Grace Heyman, in her phenomenal book, Ask of Old Paths, writes, envy distracts the envier from their own feelings of inadequacy. In other words, envy hits too close to home for us to wish to examine it, for it is wrapped up in our deepest personal discontents or insecurities about our lives. It's easier to lash out at another person than to deal with one's own feelings and fears. At envy's core is this belief that I am, in my current condition, not enough. Why was it that Eve and then Adam after her reached for that forbidden fruit? Wasn't it the not enough shame that lives at envy's core? A serpent, without ever saying it directly, convinced them that life as they knew it was not enough. That I, as I know myself, made in God's image, am not enough. And then sin matured all the way into Cain's violence against his brother Abel. Because of what? Envy. That's why Cain struck his brother. And then, of course, there's the Last Supper table that Jesus sat at with Peter and John, missing the very gift that Jesus is trying to give them because they are in a distracted, shame-drenched, insecurity-fueled argument about who's greatest. I'm not enough, and my life as it is today is not enough. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And historically, the church has lived like that's true. Take a look at this 14th century painting from the medieval artist Giotto titled Envy, which depicts envy as a woman with a snake emerging from her mouth and then hissing back at her own eyes. It's venom spewing from my mouth at another that is actually poisoning me, not them. Or Cristofano Robetta's sketch called Envy, which hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago today, that depicts envy as an old, wrinkly woman looking down her nose at youthful lovers around her, hiding behind virtue, but truly hurting in a desire for what they have that she doesn't. 16th century carver Peter Flottner's allegory of envy is the most telling. It's a creature personifying envy by gnawing at her own heart. And that last one, it's the hardest to look at to me because it reveals the most tragic truth, that envy is expressed as an attack on another, but the truth is envy is an attack on the self. Thomas Aquinas said envy is ultimately just sorrow masquerading as something else. Harvard business professor and New York Times columnist Albert Brooks said envy is the happiness killer. And my personal favorite, Joseph Epstein, the essayist, said, of all the 7 deadly sins, only envy is no fun at all. From definition to diagnosis and finally discernment. Where does envy live in me? And how do I express it? Do I wear envy quietly and internally, like shame, inadequacy, insecurity, discontentment, some variety of the not enough lie that got into Eve at the very beginning? Do I find myself trumpeting envy loudly in some form of gossip, chipping away at others, grouching, murmuration, or backbiting, or some combination of all of the above? Am I always searching for security in some kind of us versus them? Do I share the cultural obsession with the failure, expose, scandal, and downfall of public figures? And if so, why? Where does envy live in me? And how do I express it? The most obvious biblical picture of envy is the tragedy of Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. Cain murders Abel, the first death in human history, born from violence with envy at its root. Cain compares his offering and God's response to it to his brother, seething in envy. Interestingly, though, a close reading of Genesis 4 reveals that only Cain compares the two. Never once does God mention Abel's offering in comparison to Cain's. Cain competes with his brother, measuring his own self-worth on an invisible internal scoreboard that he is keeping against his most obvious reference group. But again, in Genesis 4, Cain's the only one keeping score. Not Abel. Certainly not God. The result of which is violence. Violence born out of this invisible internal story that Cain has told himself about the other people in his social circle. And that's what Paul's getting at in Romans 7. He's saying that covetousness or envy is a false desire that gives birth to every variety of violent action against God's image in God's people. Envy is so destructive, but at the very same time, it is so difficult to recognize because envy lurks in the shadowy subtleties of our lives. It feeds on the insecurities that we'd rather not name, the traumas that we'd rather not revisit, the griefs we've buried unprocessed. So let me just ask one more time. Where does envy live in me? And how do I express it? Ultimately, envy is a breakdown of love. Because at its heart, that's what original sin is. It is an internal deception about where love is found and how it's kept. Love between God and people, love between people, and even a loving view of myself. So on the other side of every diagnosis, what's the obvious question? Well, how do I treat this disease? What's the antidote to envy? It's love. It's the restoration of love. Love for God, love for others, and even a loving view of myself. But that's way too abstract. And the way that love gets restored, I think you'll find quite surprising. So we got to get more specific than that. The tried and true practice of restoring the very love at which the serpent aimed his lie is confession in community. Confession in community reconciles me to God. It undresses me of the shame that feeds on secrecy. It loves others by offering them my authentic self, and it invites others to love the real me, which is the only version of me that can receive love. I was privileged to recently have an off-the-record, in-depth conversation with arguably Portland's most seasoned and respected psychiatrist, and it was fascinating. But one of the things he told me that really surprised me is that the great need of the majority of his patients is not a professional therapist, but a trusted community. He explained, a generation ago in the church, we were asking the local community to do the psychiatrist's job. Just pray it away, just confess once, and then you'll receive grace, and your compulsive and addictive behaviors will just wash away. There was a stigma against professional counseling that kept many people from seeking the help they truly needed. Today, though, he confided, the pendulum had swung in the opposite direction. I'm being hired to do what a community is much, much more suited to do in a lot of cases, he said. And to summarize hours worth of conversation, here was his prescription for holistic spiritual formation. He said, anyone who wants to be formed into the way of Jesus has to prioritize 3 relational contexts. One is church around a stage, like the formative power of gathering for worship and teaching like we're doing now. The other is church around a table, a smaller community, like a smaller, thicker community where you can be known in both your weaknesses and need. And the last is some form of professional therapy, counseling, or mentorship, some trusted guide that knows you deeply and is helping you along the way. All of which must be jointly submitted, of course, to the way, truth, and life of Jesus. And that, he said, over time will form you into the image of Jesus, with 2 very important caveats. The first is that you hold a personal commitment to radical honesty. Like you show up to each of those environments with personal, risky, true vulnerability. And the second is that you keep showing up to all those environments for like 10 years or so. Because the way God heals us deepest is also slow. In John chapter 11, after he calls forth Lazarus from his tomb, Jesus says something I've always found kind of funny. He says, take his grave clothes off of him and let him go. Like Lazarus has arisen from the tomb, but he's still wrapped up in all the signs of death. Most of us are alive just like that, but we're wrapped up in grave clothes. We've said yes to Jesus as Savior and Lord and risen to life with him from our tombs, but we're standing this side of the tomb wrapped in grave clothes. Our outward behaviors and internal thoughts and emotions still more aligned with the wages of sin than the gift of God. So how is it that we undress ourselves of grave clothes? Well, notice who Jesus says that to. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Jesus invites Lazarus' local community of fellow forgiven sinners to undress him of the death he still wears, even this side of resurrection. Jesus breathes new life into Lazarus' body with a single word. But Jesus invites Lazarus' community to undress him of his shame. Confession to God is how we willfully invite the power of his forgiveness to free us from our sin. But confession in community is how we willfully invite the power of his people to heal us of our shame. Confession in community, practiced broadly in the modern church, can be seen today not in the church sanctuary, but most profoundly in the church basement. I can remember several years ago in New York City, settling into a squeaky metal folding chair in the back row of a meeting where I sipped weak coffee from a styrofoam cup, and the speaker called the meeting to order. And Mike was sitting next to me, and his 3-year sobriety chip was in my left pocket where I always kept it. I was an imposter among a group of friendly strangers, but Mike was my ticket in. Imposter because this was an AA meeting we were attending, and I'm someone that enjoys a stiff bourbon or a robust glass of red wine from time to time. Mike's sobriety journey began the way that most of them do, with a hard clunk at rock bottom. A bottom that he staggered up from, dazed with his marriage, family, career, his entire life just hanging by a thread. And about a year after that, he showed up to the church I pastored in Brooklyn near the end of his first year of sobriety and in search of a name for his higher power. About a year or so later, I baptized Mike in that church, and then a year or so after that, he was returning the favor, baptizing me into his community. He gave me the gift of his 3-year sobriety chip, and he invited me to attend a meeting with him in order to celebrate making it that far. And that chip and that meeting were gifts that I treasure to this day, because that Monday night imposter routine became exactly that for me, a routine. First, I was just going to offer Mike pastoral support, but then I kept going back Monday after Monday after Monday after Monday for the sake of my own apprenticeship to Jesus, because it was here among these friendly strangers that I was being schooled in the ancient and forgotten art of confession. And the particular meeting I was attending is what's called a speaker's meeting, which begins with one person sharing their own story of ongoing recovery, rock bottom to however far they've climbed and whoever they've become today. And these stories always involve the kind of unfiltered honesty that you almost never hear in the church sanctuary, but you always hear it in the church basement. But it's just that. It's the honesty of confession in a room of fellow confessors that makes the speaker's offering such a gift and makes the applause, embrace, and celebration that follows so formative in the confessor's ongoing recovery. All of it was such a stunning picture of redemption that I can remember at that first meeting after the speaker had shared and what they shared was being washed in this sea of applause, spurring them on in their journey toward recovery, that I just instinctively whispered under my breath, "Thanks be to God." Because what I'd heard, it was the living personification of the word of the Lord. Dallas Willard lamented the church's neglect of the wisdom preserved in the recovery meeting. He wrote, "It is one of the all-time great ironies of human history that the founding insights and practices of the most successful recovery program ever known, insights and practices almost 100% borrowed from the bright spots in the Christian movement, if not outright gifts of God, are not routinely taught and practiced by churches. What possible justification or explanation could there be of this fact? Confession in community for the sake of freedom was a gift from the church to the recovery meeting, and now the church needs the recovery meeting to return the favor." In the church these days, we stack up experiences in community, but we often keep what ails us deepest and plagues us most buried, hidden, and wrapped behind fig leaves. In the modern church, we bring our false selves into the very community that is meant to know, welcome, and enliven our true selves. Why can't the church be more like the recovery community? I hear that question all the time as a pastor, and I wonder it myself. So here's my take. In the recovery community, the unspoken premise of walking into the room is, I need help, and I've reached the end of trying to help myself. I need God, and I need all of you. In fact, my life depends on it. Step 1 from the big book says, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. That's the basis for gathering in a recovery meeting. It's the one and only requirement for entrance into the community, admission of personal powerlessness and an unmanageable life. In the modern church, the unspoken premise of walking through our doors is so often, I've mostly got it together, and I'm looking for a room full of other people who mostly have it together, or I might find a date and maybe even an above average sermon. I came to realize that my life was quite manageable, thank you very much, and that God's power, it seems, is made perfect in the portrayal of my strengths. That's what we say to one another again and again when we come in and out of each other's presence, wearing the clever disguise of our competence rather than the nakedness of our confession. The author Sumont Kidd reflects, the truth is, in order to heal, we need to tell our stories and have them witnessed. John Ortberg simply put it, we generally sin alone, but we heal together. We are not in need of a cure. We are in need of a community of witnesses before whom we can bring our 2 steps forward, 1 step back, dance toward healing together. Scripture counsels us to confess consistently and repeatedly, privately in prayer to God, and to confess consistently and repeatedly in community with one another. For instance, James chapter 5, therefore confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. And that English word healed, it is the Greek iomai, which means wholeness. And it's the exact same word you will find used for supernatural healing throughout the Gospels. Like it's the word used when Jesus cleanses the skin of a leper or straightens the back of a paralytic. So just to be clear, biblically speaking, supernatural healing by the touch of God looks like a paralytic dancing or a blind man seeing or Lazarus standing up and walking out of his own tomb, and you and I confessing our sins to one another in community. That's in the same category, biblically speaking. Confession is like surgery. It's not a form of healing by popping pills in private. It's a form of healing more like laying down on an operating table and allowing a community to cut me open so that the great physician can have access to what ails me deepest and threatens my life most profoundly. The modern-day French monk Jacques Philippe says, it is clear from experience the people who make the most progress in the spiritual life are not necessarily at the beginning the most virtuous or the most devout. They are those who insist on being honest with themselves and take concrete steps to truth with God. The problem is not so much with our wounds or our faults, but our failure to face up to them in the light of God. A community of witnesses, as it turns out, is the cure for shame. There is no more profound act of love than vulnerable confession in a community of trusted witnesses. So we're beginning 2026 in a teaching series on the 7 deadly sins: anger, greed, pride, sloth, vanity, gluttony, and the envy that runs beneath them all. A list of vices that you admittedly won't find anywhere in the Bible. Where do they come from then? Well, all the way back in the 4th century, there was a Turkish follower of Jesus named Evagrius who wandered off into the desert. He was one of many who would later come to be known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers. They were living through the first of many eras of compromise in church history when the community of Jesus' followers held separate beliefs to the broader culture, but they had vices that were curved in the exact same direction as the broader culture. So Evagrius is remembered particularly among the Desert Fathers and Mothers because he authored this very highly influential book back in the day titled Talking Back, a monastic handbook for combating demons, just in case anyone's looking for a spring break beach read. Evagrius ordered that book into 8 chapters, all based on the capital vices that were common to all of Jesus' apprentices. His 8 were later collapsed into 7 by combining pride with vainglory because they were very similar, and the 7 deadly sins were born. All to say, this isn't pop psychology. It is rich, historic, deep, substantive Christianity. We're beginning with envy because from the 10 Commandments to Paul's letter to the Romans to the Desert Fathers and Mothers to modern psychology, envy lies at the root of all the other 6. Just like supermodel Cameron Russell attests, there is no achievement in vanity that outruns the envy of my reference group. As John D. Rockefeller so bluntly stated, greed will never be enough as long as envy's in my soul. And as the Irish poet Brennan Behan said, we've all got appetites in us that are as unfillable as the ocean. So our practice this week and throughout the teaching series as we gather around the table in our Bridgetown communities will be community through the weekly exercise of confession. That paradoxical way that we get free from envy and restore love. The truth is, though, confession is very compelling to talk about distantly and imaginatively, but terrifying to choose personally. It is so compelling and such a gift to watch someone like Dave stand up here and share his own ongoing redemption stories. He names his weakness. It's so compelling to hear about an AA meeting I went to like 12 or 15 years ago in a different city across the country. But to show up this week to a room full of people that you see Tuesday after Tuesday and gather around the table and say something like, the truth is I envy my little sister because I feel like she's been dealt an easy hand and that success and looks and prosperity and all these things that I want have come to her quite naturally. But as I trace that envy to its root, my deep fear is that Jesus isn't guiding me to life and life to the full. Either because he doesn't know the way or because he loves me in some ultimate sense but doesn't like me and desire to bless me in an immediate sense. There's a deep fear about who God is and who I am in his eyes that lies underneath the way that I like to chip away at my little sister. And that's what confession means. So if you want this exercise to form you in these 7 weeks, you're going to need to show up thoughtfully and vulnerably to your community. You're going to need to be self-reflective enough to trace your outward expression of each of these 7 deadly sins to its internal root within you, to the very personal fear or distrust or self-critique that is lying at the heart of your outward behavior, and share it in that room. You're going to need to be courageous enough to name it aloud to both God and to the community that God has surrounded you with for the sake of your healing right now, even though they're just as imperfect and ordinary as you and me. And you're going to need to be patient enough to persevere in this practice because God works deepest slowly. So we can't demand complete freedom after one moment of confession. What we can do is fight. We can wage war against the principalities and powers that are oppressing us. We can overturn the lies that we're prone to believe. We can take our stand against the devil's schemes by the very weapon that Jesus promised will be on the back of every one of his followers, and that's a cross. A willing death to my false self. The strong version of me that has their life quite manageable, thank you very much. I can show up to a community and crucify that lie week after week after week through the practice of confession, that I might rise to life week after week after week through the practice of confession. 4th century church father St. Augustine counsels, during this earthly pilgrimage, our life cannot be free from temptation. For none of us comes to know ourselves except through the experience of temptation, nor can we be crowned until we've come through victorious, nor can we be victorious until we've been in battle, nor can we fight our battles unless we have an enemy and temptations to overcome. So why would you study 7 sins? Like, are we that morbid and morose and evil obsessed? No. It's because to win a fight against a deceiver, you got to study his schemes and strategies. You've got to know his tricks. And this is about fighting. Fighting to surrender. Fighting to die. Fighting to love. It's about learning to take up our battle against the devil's schemes by confessing, which is not waving a white flag of surrender, but planting a flag of victory in the very ground in my life that the liar is trying to take by his deception again. It is by confession and community that we can be washed and washed and washed by wave after wave of the grace and love of God, who made us first, who knows us deepest, who is more committed to us than we even are to ourselves, and who will not stop until he has remade us in his image.
Thanks for joining the Bridgetown family as we engage in this teaching series. To learn more about the life of our church and how you can get involved, visit bridgetown.church/welcome. If you're interested in contributing financially to Bridgetown Church and to our ministry, you can do that at bridgetown.church/giving. Wherever you're joining us from, we hope this resource blesses you and encourages you to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus did.